I want to thank Magic City, and I want to thank our guest, Scott Pelley, for being with us this evening. I grew up on 60 Minutes. He said he grew up on 60 Minutes. And I know that, that what we're in for this evening is a delightful presentation. So without any further ado, Scott Pelley.
Thank you. You know, it's so great to have an audience, a live audience in this room with me. I never get to have that. I'm on television. I never see your faces. I'm at the mercy of the remote control. One punch and I'm gone. It reminds me of a trip that I took with my family to Lake Placid up in upstate New York, and I arranged for my son, who was, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years old at the time, arranged for him and I to go out, just the two of us, on a canoe on Lake Placid. Every father's dream. We go out first thing, sun's rising, the mist is rising off the lake, the loons are calling, we push the canoe out into this perfectly flat lake. Every father's dream. And we're paddling along, and after a few minutes I hear the soft, sweet sound of my little boy's voice. And he says, "Dad, do we have to do this?" So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're all in the same boat together. And I hope you don't mind doing this. You know, I've been at CBS News for 31 years. I've been at 60 Minutes for 21 years, and I could not have imagined the opportunity to travel all around the world and meet so many interesting people. You know, I always tell journalism students that journalism is the greatest continuing education program, because all we do all day long is talk to the most interesting people in the world, find the most interesting stories that we can share with you. And one of the things that is really interesting is all of the crazy characters that we have an opportunity to meet. With a lot of these ideas is that the President of the United States is not the CEO of America.
That's right.
The Constitution is going to tell you no. The Congress is going to tell you no.
We'll
the Supreme Court is going to tell you no.
Well, we'll see.
And you're not used to working in an environment like that.
I do it all the time. I
Who
do it all
tells
the
you
time.
no?
I do it all the time. Not that many people. No, I do it all the time.
Not that many people. I threw open my laptop one day and I started writing Truth Worth Telling. I didn't intend to write a memoir. I didn't intend to write much of anything at all, but one word led to another, one experience to another, and I really enjoyed the writing of the book. But here's something that I understood at the very beginning. No one was clamoring for a memoir from Scott Pelley. No one was going to sit still for that. So what I did realize was I had met some of the most compelling people in the world who discovered the meaning of their lives during some of the great historic events of these last several decades. And so that's who I wrote about, not me, but the people that I met. And each chapter is named for the virtues and the values that these people discovered in themselves. Chapters, for example, that are entitled Courage and Selflessness and Authenticity. And the very first chapter in the book is entitled Gallantry. And it's what I witnessed on this day. This is 9/11, 2001. I was at the World Trade Center when the buildings came down. And I was standing there watching the firefighters of the fire department of the city of New York charging into those towers against just the chance that they might be able to save someone. So the first chapter deals with what I saw on that day among those firefighters and all of the research I have been able to do since, going through transcripts of 911 calls, through transcripts of fire department radio frequencies, through various kinds of engineering analyses of why the towers fell down. And I was able to paint a full picture of what occurred on that day. One of the things that I discovered was that in building number 2, there were 2 people who came very close to meeting one another. One was a woman by the name of Melissa Doy. She was an office worker. She was trapped and had called 911 to give the firefighters a sense of what their location was in the building. At the same time, a firefighter was rising toward Melissa Doy. It had been thought that the firefighters had reached no higher than the 50th floor, but this man had gone to 79 and was still climbing. This, if you'll permit me, is the story of Melissa Doy and the firefighter who was rising toward her. Just a few pages of truth worth telling. At the moment the 911 operator answered her call, Doy can be overheard nearing the end of the Hail Mary prayer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. 911 operator, good day. I'm on the 83rd floor. I'm on the 83rd floor, Doy shouted into the phone. The nose of United Flight 175 had hit 2 floors below her. Part of the right wing ripped into Doy's 83rd floor. Ma'am, how you doing? The operator speaking to Missy Doy was a woman. Listening to the recording, I suspect she's middle-aged and experienced. Her voice is earnest and empathetic. Are you going to be able to get somebody up here? Doy asked. I'm struck by the youth in Doy's pleading soprano. Of course, ma'am. We're coming up to you. Well, there's no one here yet, and the floor is completely engulfed. We're on the floor, and we can't breathe, and it's very, very, very hot. The operator was right. There was a firefighter rising toward Doy. Chief Oreo Palmer of Battalion 7 was well known for his unusual first name, which, of course, earned him the moniker Cookie. From his radio transmissions, we know that Palmer reached the 78th floor, the bottom of the gash blasted into the tower by the 767. Ladder 1-5, Palmer called. We've got 2 to 3 pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Palmer had taken the one working elevator in the building as high as it would go, which was the 40th floor, and he had climbed the stairwells from that point. And after 37 flights of stairs, Palmer was finally out of breath. The horror of the 78th floor added an edge to his voice. Palmer keyed his mic to request that his next transmission be passed on to the incident command post. Radio, that 78th floor, numerous 1045 code 1s. Fatalities, more than he could count, were strewn across the 78th floor. The 4 floors above 78 were heavily damaged. The nearest survivors to Palmer were likely 5 floors above him on 83, including Missy Doy and her 5 co-workers. I'm going to die, aren't I? Doy said to the operator. No, ma'am. No, say I'm going to die. Ma'am, say your prayers, the operator counseled. I'm going to die, Doy repeated. In the recording, I do not hear panic. Her voice sounds as though she had come to a realization. I am going to die was self-empathy reconciling with the inevitable. The 2 women on the telephone line, strangers who would never meet, formed an intimate bond. We got to think positive, the operator urged, because we have to help each other get off this floor. Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm. You're doing a good job, ma'am. You're doing a good job. It's so hot. I'm burning up, Doi said. Then she asked whether her mother could be patched into the call. The operator explained that she had no way of making a third-party connection. 5 floors below, Oreo Palmer began directing the firefighting attack. He radioed the men of Ladder 15 who were still headed up. I'm going to need your firefighters. Adam's stairway to knock down 2 fires. Get a house line connected and stretched. We can get some water on it and knock it down. Palmer had discovered the only intact stairwell above the point of impact. If he could extinguish the fire in stairway A, more than 600 people would have a way out. Ladder 15 replied, all right, 10-4, we're coming up the stairs. We're on 77 now on the B stair. We'll be right to you. Before this recording was discovered, investigators estimated that the firefighters had reached no higher than 50 floors. Battalion 9, I need you on the floor above 79, Palmer advised his fellow chief. We have access stairs going to 79. All right, I'm on my way up, Oreo, Battalion 9 responded. At 9:57 a.m., it appears the one elevator stopped working. A member of Ladder 15 radioed, trapped in the elevator shaft. You're going to have to get a different elevator. We are chopping through the wall to get out. Wait. We hear voices, Doi reported to the 911 operator. Hello, help, she shouted into the burning room, and then she screamed, help, help. Doi asked the operator, can you find out if anybody's on the 83rd floor? We think we heard somebody. What Doi heard is unknown. But based on the records that I have studied, it is plausible that Oreo Palmer and perhaps some of the men of Ladder 15 continued climbing the intact stairway A, fighting the fire as they rose. Having received no answer, Doi returned to the call. Can you stay on the line with me, please? I feel like I'm dying. Are they inside with you yet, dear? The operator asked. No, Doi said. Can you find out where they are? Can? That was Missy Doi's last word. By my count, the operator called her name without response more than 60 times over the next 13 minutes. When I arrived at the World Trade Center on West Street, first thing I noticed was that tall television mast on building number 1, and it looked like it was ticking back and forth like a metronome. And I thought, well, that can't be. I thought it was the heat torturing the light. But the moment I thought that, the building started to come down. Now, you've heard people describe moments of catastrophe as unfolding as if they were in slow motion. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's true, because what I saw in my mind's eye was one floor falling and then stopping, and then the next and stopping. And I thought, well, maybe it won't come all the way down. But of course, what we all saw was the building rushing to the ground with heartbreaking speed. I don't know how I got there, but the next thing I remember is being on my knees in the middle of West Street, watching the building come down, and calling out to God. And I said, Lord, take them all with no pain. I don't remember getting up. The next thing I recall is running as fast as I could, with the sound of steel crashing into the street behind me. After some number of blocks and some number of minutes, it occurred to me that the conflagration had begun to subside. And I turned around and went back into what would become known as Ground Zero. I was there for 2 weeks. CBS News was on the air for 97 hours, nonstop, no commercials, all day, all night. Everything that Ed Murrow started when he invented broadcast journalism in World War II, everything that Walter Cronkite had done, everything that Dan Rather had carried on had brought us to this day, and I believe it was our finest hour. There is no democracy without journalism. And it is in moments of crisis like this that journalism, free, independent information, is the lifeblood of a country in crisis. When I was writing this chapter, which is entitled Gallantry, the FDNY, I reflected on why those firemen were charging past me up those stairwells. 343 members of the FDNY were killed in 90 minutes. It is the largest loss of life of any emergency service in history in a single day and a single event. It occurred to me that the firefighters, years or even decades before, had on their first day sworn to protect the people of the city of New York, and they had decided then what they would do on this day. I witnessed a similar kind of virtue at this location. This is the Air Force Theater Hospital in Balad, Iraq, in 2007. The hospital was a collection of 32 tents. It wasn't very impressive from the outside, but if you stepped into any one of the tents, you would encounter the most high-tech, the most skilled medicine being practiced anywhere in the world. This was where our most seriously wounded Marines and soldiers were brought. They wanted to shorten the time it took to get these critically injured young men and women to the hospital, so they built the hospital as close to the battle as they could. The surgeons wore sidearms while doing surgery in the operating rooms. I was there one afternoon when a young Marine by the name of Kenny Lyon came blasting into the emergency room on a gurney. He was unconscious and nearly gone. He was bleeding from 3 lacerated arteries. He'd just come off the helicopter. He had been hit by an enemy mortar when he was outside his armored vehicle. Kenny went right into the operating room because they had to stop the bleeding. They had to stop the bleeding right away, or they were going to lose him. And so I stood there in the operating room and watched this while standing alongside an Air Force nurse who was in charge of the operating rooms at Balad. The chapter is named for her. The chapter is called Selflessness, Paulette Schenk. It's a battle, you know? Sometimes people are fighting to die, Paulette Schenk told me. She was a nurse anesthetist from a hospital outside Philadelphia, but in Iraq, she was Lieutenant Colonel Schenk, U.S. Air Force Reserve, in charge of the operating rooms at the Air Force Hospital on the Iraqi base. Fighting to die? I asked her. meaning their body is going further and further down the wrong direction, and you have to be able to resuscitate them so that we can stop that negative spiral downward, so we can go back to the spiral of life. Shank stood over Kenny Lyon in her pastel scrubs and abstract watercolor ensemble in pinks and blues and greens. Her hairnet capped her close-cropped hair, which was brown, tending toward red. Her face was free of makeup that might have covered the scattering of freckles that bridged her nose. In her late 40s, Shank worked with a quiet, gentle confidence that told everyone in the room that she had done this 10,000 times. If Lyons spent another minute in the emergency room, he would reach the end of his spiral. I followed as he was rushed into the next tent, an operating room, where 5 surgeons went to work, 2 at Lyons' head, 1 at his torso, and 2 at his legs. IVs of blood and fluids would buy time, but if they did not stop the bleeding, soon they would lose him. I watched his battle for more than 2 hours when a nurse informed the surgeons that the bank had no more blood to give. The whole supply of fresh blood had run through Lyons' heart and out onto the white linoleum floor. "I'll get you more," Shank called to the surgeons. She bolted out of the operating room. "More?" I said to myself, "There isn't any more." I ran after Shank through the plywood corridor that led to the next tent. When I entered the blood bank, she had already opened her arm. Lying on a gurney, under the glare of bare fluorescent tubes, her blood was draining into plastic bags. She gambled that these pints might stall the death man, while loudspeakers announced the shortage to every available airman. Walt Whitman captured the sense of this. The American poet was a nurse in the Civil War, and in The Wound Dresser, he writes of a fallen soldier. "One turns to me his appealing eyes. Poor boy, I never knew you. Yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if it would save you." Paulette Shank told me, "Our job is to resuscitate, to allow the surgeons time to stop the bleeding, and you try." Her voice cracked under the weight of memories. "You try so hard, and sometimes you're not successful." She paused, looked away to a distant time, then closed her eyes. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And it hurts. You feel like you let the soldier down, you know? The wicked death spiral won, and you fought so hard. We fight so hard against him winning, you know, and sometimes the death man wins. But not this time." Kenny's surgery went on for 5 hours. They had to take his left leg because they just couldn't stop the bleeding in that artery. But the blood that Paulette Shank donated in that instant bought a few minutes, and then outside the blood bank there were 60 or 80 men and women who were donating their blood because of the all call that went out across the base. And they passed those bags of blood in, one after another, and 5 hours later, Kenny was in recovery. They saved his life. I met the conscious Kenny Lyon about 3 months later at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. He had this contraption around him that wired his jaw together. He'd lost part of his tongue, and he was trying to get used to his new prosthetic left leg. And I said, "Kenny, how you doing?" And Kenny said, "I'm great. I'm alive." And I said, what do you mean? He said, this is a direct quote. He said, "It's all gravy from here." But now you know why I call that chapter about Paulette Schenck's selflessness one of the virtues that I've had the opportunity to witness around the world over these many, many years. That's Paulette right there, the silhouette in the beginning, watching over Kenny's surgery. You know, people often ask me, I've been at 60 Minutes 21 years, which means I've done about 450 stories for the broadcast, and people always ask me, what's your favorite interview? Well, I love all my children. But one of the best interviews I think we have done at 60 Minutes involved a man who was on this. That is the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, which many of you will remember in 2011 exploded and sank in the Gulf of Mexico, unleashing the largest accidental oil spill in history. Well, we found a crew member. This was when the ship was still on fire. It had not even sunk yet. A crew member named Mike Williams, who was an electronics engineer. He fixed all the gadgets that kept the ship running, and he had a shop in the middle of the ship. He told us about that night. And the first thing he said that he noticed was that the massive turbine engines that provided power to the ship began spinning out of control for some reason. He couldn't figure it out. But what he didn't know was that methane gas from 5 miles below was shooting up through the well onto the deck and being sucked into these turbine engines, which caused them to go into overspeed.
I hear the engines revving. The lights are glowing. I'm hearing the alarms. I mean, they're at a constant state now. It's just beep, 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 beep. It doesn't stop. But even that's starting to get drowned out by the sound of the engine increasing in speed. And my lights get so incredibly bright that they physically explode. I'm pushing my way back from the desk when my computer monitor exploded. And I reached for the door to exit my shop. These are 3-inch thick steel fire-rated doors with 6 stainless steel hinges supporting them on the frame. As I reached for the handle, I heard this awful hissing noise, this whoosh, and at the height of the hiss, a huge explosion. The explosion literally rips the door from the hinges. Impacts me and takes me to the other side of the shop. And I'm up against the wall when I finally come around with a door on top of me. And I remember thinking to myself, this is it. I'm going to die right here. As I got to the next door, it exploded and took me, the door, and slid me about 35 feet backwards again and planted me up against another wall. At that point, I actually got angry. I was mad at the doors. I was mad that these fire doors that are supposed to protect me are hurting me. These fire doors are trying to kill me. And at that point, I made a decision. I'm going to get outside. I may die out there, but I'm going to get outside.
Every Sunday morning, they practice the lifeboat drills. And they practiced their lifeboat drills every Sunday because they wanted to make sure that no one ever got left behind. Well, Mike Williams gets out on the deck and he discovers that the lifeboats are gone. And there are other crew members up there as well, including a woman by the name of Andrea.
I remember looking at Andrea and telling her, or looking at her and seeing that look in her eyes of, she had quit. She had given up. I remember her saying, I'm scared. And I said, it's okay to be scared. I'm scared too. She said, what are we going to do? I said, we're going to burn up or we're going to jump. And she said she couldn't jump. I remember telling her, if you don't jump, I'm going to throw you. We have to get off of here. We can't stay here.
How far is it to the sea?
maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways. I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off into the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
Mike and Andrea were wearing their life jackets. They hit the sea only to discover there was so much oil and gas in the water that the water was on fire. Then Mike hears in the distance, "Over here, over here." Fishing boats. No one sent them, no one called them. In the middle of the night, they saw the explosion and came to the aid of their fellow mariners and pulled Mike and Andrea and many others out of the burning sea. Now, this was early in the investigation as to how this kind of catastrophe could happen. I mean, it's incredibly rare. So members of the House and the Senate were holding hearings that very week, and they were frustrated that they weren't getting the answers that they needed. Well, the witness on that Monday morning after the 60 Minutes story was Ken Salazar. He was the Secretary of the Interior, and as Secretary of the Interior, he had responsibility for offshore drilling. This is what happened on Capitol Hill the morning after our 60 Minutes piece aired.
Last night I saw the rerun of in fact I saw it 3 times. Mike Williams on 60 Minutes, I'm sure all of you saw that.
I did not watch the 60-minute episode that you referred to.
60 Minutes did a piece, as is so often the case, that I thought was really interesting.
We hear on 60 Minutes what we couldn't hear from industry witnesses.
I don't know if you had the chance to see the 60 Minutes, call it expose.
I did not watch the 60-minute program.
Goodness.
I watched 60 Minutes on Sunday.
I did not watch it because I have been working on the Gulf incident nonstop, so
This is the Gulf incident we're talking about.
So the moral of that story is don't miss 60 Minutes. Most of the people in Truth Worth Telling are people whose names you do not know, but they will be people whose names you will never forget. Another one of them is a gentleman by the name of Bao Tong. He's a Chinese man, and the role that he played in history was that he was the highest ranking member of the Communist Party to oppose the Tiananmen Square massacre. He was the chief of staff to the president when thousands of students poured into Tiananmen Square. You can think of Tiananmen Square as sort of Capitol Hill because that's where all of the major political offices are in Beijing, around that square. And thousands of students had occupied it, as you all recall. But we know how this story ends. The hardliners won. They sent the military in and murdered perhaps more than 1,000 unarmed people. They couldn't do that until they did one thing first. They sent the secret police in to arrest Bao Tong. They had to get him out of the way in order to send the military in, and he spent the next 10 years and more in solitary confinement. In 1998, I was the chief White House correspondent, and Bill Clinton was going to be the first president to go to China since Tiananmen. And a few months before that, Bao Tong had been released from prison. Well, I very much wanted to interview Bao. How much do you think a man who spent a decade in solitary confinement wanted to go on CBS News and criticize his government? Turns out, very, very much. But there was a problem. He was under 24/7 surveillance by the secret police. They were never going to let me go to Bao's home, and they were never going to let him come to some hotel where I had cameras set up. So we had to come up with a plan. The plan was hatched by my producer, Bill Owens, and our Beijing bureau producer, Natalie Liu. You know, funny little aside about Bill Owens. He used to work for me, but now he's the executive producer of 60 Minutes, so I work for him. Remember what they say about being nice to people on the way up, because you're going to meet them on the way down? That's exactly what happened to me. Bill Owens designed a plan that would unfold in Purple Bamboo Park, a 115-acre oasis of lakes and lawns in northwest Beijing, an affluent part of the capital where universities are clustered. When we arrived in the park, summer was blossoming. The sky was gauzed by high cirrus. Families in canopied boats drifted through groves of lotus propelled by gondoliers sculling red oars in a lazy rhythm. One boy, pleased with his cleverness, plucked a broad lotus flower and raised it against the sun like a parasol. Along the edges of the park's concrete trails, bamboo pickets were set up to keep visitors off the carefully tended greens. On June 27, 1998, Bao Tong ambled down one of the pathways in the park and settled onto a green wooden bench. Across the path, directly opposite Bao, our cameraman, Raleigh Maliksi, sat with a camera hidden in a shoulder bag. I came from the opposite direction and sat with Bao, a nearly invisible wireless mic pinned inside my shirt. There was no telling what would happen next as this soft-spoken man risked everything to test his people's right to be heard. Bao began. According to our Constitution, I have freedom of speech. However, whether I do indeed have the freedom of speech, I do not know. I think CBS can conduct a test. Let's see whether I get into trouble after your interview with me. If so, it will demonstrate that our government does not respect its own Constitution. What should Americans understand about the struggle in China? I asked. If people can check and balance the power of the government, then the government can become a force for world peace, but otherwise, it's a dangerous force. Bao told me that China could not progress politically until the Communist Party admitted that the Tiananmen Square massacre was wrong. I feel sad, ashamed, and proud at the same time, he told me. Proud of those students, the citizens of Beijing, the people. After a few minutes, we parted. Bao ambled away, and I walked in the opposite direction. And that is when I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, another cameraman with a shoulder bag. He was a member of a Chinese secret police surveillance team. Bill, Natalie, and I quickened our pace slightly but deliberately. A moment later, I saw a furious man sprinting toward us. He was red with rage and closing fast. We began an undignified trot, but the man kept accelerating and screaming, now waving a fist. I began wondering about Chinese jails as we broke into a full run. The man matched our pace. Natalie and I were falling short of breath when I shouted, "What's he saying? What's he saying?" He's saying, "Keep off the grass." You can't make this stuff up. We're running short on time, and I want to take a few questions, but I want to tell you one more story that's in this book, because the book had been put to bed when these events I'm about to tell you unfolded, and I called my editor and I said, literally, stop the presses. I have to write another chapter. This is northern Iraq. The sandbags you see there are the line a few years ago that separated the civilized world from ISIS. And ISIS had run through northern Iraq in a part of the country that is occupied by about 500,000 people who are Yazidis. The Yazidis are a persecuted minority. They practice a religion that's about 3,000 years older than Islam. And so when ISIS went through those villages, they murdered all the men. They kidnapped all the women and sold the women into slavery. One of my great associate producers, Rachel Morehouse, went into a Yazidi refugee camp to see if she could find anyone who would talk to us about these atrocities. She found this young woman. She was very hesitant, 20 years old. She wasn't sure that she wanted to be known. She didn't want to be on 60 Minutes. She had been sold and raped and sold and raped and sold and raped until she was able to escape and find her way to that refugee camp. Rachel brought her to where we had set up our cameras, and I could see how frightened she was, and the first thing I said to her was, let's not do this. There's no obligation. We do not have to do this. Somehow she felt like she wanted the world to know what had happened. So she had some conditions. She wanted to wear this scarf. She did not want us to use her name. She asked that the men in my camera team stand behind curtains so that she couldn't see them and they couldn't see her. And she asked that Rachel Morehouse sit next to her and hold her hand, which we did, of course. At the beginning of the interview, she was very frightened and hesitant, especially as she talked about the horrific things that had happened to her. But then as the interview went on, a certain amount of confidence seemed to inform her, and it occurred to me in that moment that in the beginning of the interview, she was speaking for herself. But as the interview progressed, she realized she was speaking for her people. Well, she was resettled in Germany. The Germans took tens of thousands of Yazidi refugees. When she got to Germany, she joined a Yazidi human rights organization and began working with them. The United Nations heard about her and asked her to come speak to a conference in Geneva about the crimes that women suffer in war. One thing led to another. About 5 years after that interview we did, I'm in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., preparing for another interview when the phone rang. And that was when I learned that Nadia Murad had won the Nobel Peace Prize. She found a human rights lawyer, somebody named Amal Clooney, I think it is. And they are now working with the United Nations and the government of Iraq, trying to encourage the government of Iraq to have war crime trials, internationally verified war crime trials, so that the crimes against the Yazidis can be documented, so that they can never be denied, and so that the people who committed these acts of genocide against these people can be brought to justice at last. Let me just say one thing about journalism before I turn it over to your questions. A guy ran up to me the other day in Manhattan and he said, "Oh man, this must be a terrible time to be a reporter." And I said, no, it's a great time to be a reporter because of all of the rhetoric we're hearing from Washington about fake news and about enemy of the American people. This is an opportunity for us to show the American people what we do, how we do it, and what our values are. When I was anchoring the CBS Evening News in the first year of the president's administration, we were very frank about when the president was telling the truth and when he was not. And one night, immediately after the broadcast, he tweeted out that CBS News was the enemy of the American people. I had lunch with the president 2 weeks later at the White House, me and a few other reporters, and I privately told the president, I said, "Sir, criticize the media. We're human beings, we make mistakes all the time. But this enemy of the American people stuff, it just makes me worry that some poor deranged individual is going to go into a newsroom and shoot the receptionist because he's the enemy of the American people." And the president thought for a moment, and then he turned to me and he said, and this is a direct quote from the President of the United States, he said, "I don't worry about that." Now, I was wrong, of course. It wasn't the hateful rhetoric about journalists that caused some poor deranged individual to pick up a gun. It was the hateful rhetoric about immigration that caused a gunman in August to go into a Walmart in El Paso and shoot dead 22 people, wound 24 because they were Hispanic. And in the gunman's mind, if they were Hispanic, then how could they be Americans? We are experiencing, in my view, in this country at this moment, what I call ignorance posing as enlightenment. Ignorance of science, ignorance of immigration policy, ignorance of religion, ignorance of race, ignorance of each other. But this brand of ignorance tells us that it understands these issues better than anyone. Ignorance posing as enlightenment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is where journalism comes in. There is no democracy without journalism, because in a democracy, we all must have generally reliable, generally down the middle of the road information in order to make decisions about our lives and the life of our country. That is how democracies work. It is the lifeblood of the entire thing. There was a worse time for journalism in America. It was 1798. You have to go back a ways. Congress, in its infinite wisdom in 1798, passed the Sedition Act, which made it a felony for any reporter to be critical of any member of Congress or the President of the United States. Can you imagine? This was signed into law by President Adams, and reporters and editors went to jail for criticizing the government. Well, in 1800, James Madison, who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you might imagine what Madison thought of the Sedition Act. In 1800, he told us, he said this in a critique of the Sedition Act. He said, "Freedom of the press is the right that guarantees all the others." He knew if we could say what we wanted to say, read what we wanted to read, write what we wanted to write, then all the rights in the Bill of Rights would be protected. The stakes are just that high. I tell journalism students that everyone in our country enjoys the right to a free press, but for us in that profession, I tell them, it's not a right. Freedom of the press is not a right. It is endless days of risk and effort and work and striving so that everyone in America can enjoy Madison's guarantee of freedom. That is a fight worth fighting and a truth worth telling. I am so grateful to all of you for your kind attention tonight. Thank you for coming out in this terrible rain, and thank you for being with me. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. That's so kind of you. I have run over time. Technically, we don't have time for questions, but I'm going to take a couple anyway, which is not something I can ever do on 60 Minutes. I can't run over time. You know, whack, it's over. But here I can run a little bit long, I think. So I'm going to take the questions. I'm going to repeat them so everybody can hear them, and we'll move on from here. Yes, ma'am. We'll start with you.
As everyday citizens, what can we do to protect journalists?
She asked, as everyday citizens, what can we do to protect journalists? First of all, I like the concept very much. Support journalism, subscribe to your paper, or subscribe to any papers that you want to subscribe to. It's not free. We will spend at 60 Minutes $250,000 on just one of those 3 stories that you see on Sunday night. It's not free. So support journalism in every way you can. You lead me to another thing that worries me greatly about our country, and it's a new responsibility that we all share. Never before in human history has more information been available to more people, and that's a wonderful thing. But it's also true that never before in human history has more bad information been available to more people. And so now all of you have a responsibility that you've never had before, and every generation to follow will have this same responsibility. When I was coming up, there were 3 television networks, as God intended. I miss those days. But now with the proliferation of media, everybody's writing everything with all kinds of different standards, right? Now, some of us in journalism have what I call reputational risk. If I get something wrong at 60 Minutes, there is hell to pay. I could lose my job. My people could lose their job. 60 Minutes gets a huge black eye. So how much do we work every day to make sure we don't get anything wrong? And something still slips through every once in a while. So if you see something on the internet, this is your new responsibility. If you see something in the media that just outrages you, you can't believe this terrible person, this terrible thing happened, what you have to do now is triangulate your information. You have to say, I wonder what the Tulsa World is reporting on this story. I wonder what Fox News is reporting on this story. I wonder what CNN is reporting on this story. The beauty part is, that's now easier than it's ever been. You can do the exercise that I just suggested in a minute, in a minute and a half in your kitchen. But unfortunately, it's now, I believe, mandatory. What is the fastest way to destroy a democracy? Is it terrorism, war, another Great Depression? I don't think so. The fastest way to destroy a democracy is to poison the information. Our adversaries have figured this out. Our adversaries, both foreign and domestic. And so now we have this responsibility to verify the information that we're receiving. Thank you for the question. Maybe, how many more questions can I take? 2. Okay. We all have our masters. Yes, sir.
You mentioned how God intended the 3 main news agencies, television agencies. I remember watching you on WFAA in Tulsa, Dallas, and just wondered, how did you develop your beautiful storytelling style of the Earth Night since then?
The question is, he's been watching my work for a very long time. The man has a deep and powerful memory. He wondered how I developed my beautiful, wasn't that the term? Beautiful writing style. This is what I tell to journalism students, and we have some in the room tonight, that to learn how to write, study great writing. The last chapter in the book is my favorite chapter. It's called To a Young Journalist, and it's all the advice that I could possibly come up with, because as I said before, that there's no democracy without journalism, well, that means we need great journalists, right? We need as many as we can get. We need them all, and we need them to be good. So in terms of writing, I just watched the people that I admired. When I saw something on television or read something in a newspaper or a magazine, I would study it. Why is this so compelling? How could this be so beautifully written? How was this done? And I studied. I had fire in the belly for this job from the very beginning. I had a high school journalism teacher, Marjorie Wilson, who was on fire to teach. If she had been teaching accounting, I would be a CPA today. But she was on fire to teach and made journalism feel like the most romantic, the greatest responsibility that one could undertake. And so with that fire of enthusiasm, I started on my career. I started as a copy boy at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, working in the wire room, the 3 to midnight shift. And I had a little bit of a temporal problem. They only hired kids who were 16, and I was 15. So I did what everyone would do. I lied about my age. My career in pursuit of the truth began with a lie. And my co-conspirator mom would drop me off about 2 blocks from the paper so that nobody could see that I didn't have a driver's license. And one day the executive editor of the paper came into the wire room after I'd been there about a year, and he said, "Do you want to be a reporter?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't given it any thought." And he said, "Well, do you or don't you?" And I said, "Well, sure, I guess." And he took me out of the wire room, sat me down in front of this machine. It was called a typewriter. And I had no idea how to operate it, but I have been a reporter ever since. Another question. Yes, sir.
From your vantage point, as you perceive the divisions in our country, and what you've done throughout our country, what is your thought about those divisions? And do you see a path forward? Is there a way to progress?
The question, for those of you who might not have heard it, is the divisions in the country. How do we heal them? How do we move forward? And this is a great place to end tonight, and thank you for that very insightful question. I was talking earlier about the proliferation of media. One of the things that is occurring in our country right now is that there are media outlets on the left, on the right, that are carving out a small niche audience by feeding nothing but confirming information. You can watch television all day, left or right, and be told that everything you already believe is right. And boy, that's a warm feeling. I fear that we are now capable of walling ourselves off in digital citadels of confirming information. And that we risk from that a new Cold War, but this time a civil war. Democracies do not work this way. Why were democracies invented? Democracies were invented because every single one of us in this room has different ideas about where we came from, where we're going, and how we should get there. And so democracies were designed to keep us from each other's throats, to move a country, not left, not right, but forward with compromise. Nobody gets everything they want, but the country is better off, and we all move forward in a democracy. So we are in a perilous moment, in my view, in which hostile actors, foreign and domestic, are poisoning our information, and at the same time, we, in many cases, have stopped listening to each other. because we don't have to anymore. We don't have to be challenged by an idea that we haven't heard before. And that is a very dangerous place for us to be. Is there a solution to that? Man, I wish I had it. What I think is there must be, or we can't move forward as a country. I remember a time on Capitol Hill, for example, when the other guy had a bad idea. Now, the other guy is a bad guy. And you can't compromise with the bad guy, the guy who you think is evil. The Republicans and the Democrats used to beat the hell out of each other all day long, go down to the bottom of Capitol Hill to a bar and drink all night long together. They don't do that anymore. They literally don't socialize anymore, because if a Democrat and a Republican go to dinner together, somebody's going to take a picture and hang it around the neck of those politicians in the next primary. We have, as a nation, to start listening to one another, to have the courage to listen to ideas that may not appeal to us, the courage to work on issues across the aisle, and everyone gets that they're not going to get everything they're looking for, but our country will move forward. That is what made the last century America's century. Great journalism, great arguments, great information, people willing to listen. And if we're going to have another American century, we have to find our way home. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I'm grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Dan, I'm so grateful.